All right, greetings UNAT community. My name is Felipe Cuartas Villa, and this is going to be my oral defense for my pedagogical research proposal. My project is titled Microscope Based Collaborative World Building to Mediate Speaking Confidence in Synchronous Virtual EFL Classes. This research was developed in the context of my pedagogical practice in the PPOE or Pedagogical Practice in Online Environments course at the UNAT College. Right. So my practice scenario was a synchronous virtual practicum in English 7 or English conversational. The students were pre-service English teachers with an expected level between B2 and C1 according to CEFR proficiency level. Although the group was academically prepared and willing to participate, I identified a specific interactional barrier uh, related to their knowledge and their oral confidence because those two didn't add up. All right, so the main problem that was found was the participation gap because the students show comprehension and a willingness, but there was no spontaneous oral participation and it was very limited. So some students hesitated or gave very brief and safe answers and avoided any kind of improvisation or depended heavily on teacher guidance and some scaffolding. For this reason, I understood speaking confidence as an observable classroom behavior that was actually palpable in the class. Right. So for this research, the general objective proposed was to explore how collaborative world building mediates speaking confidence. Specifically, I wanted to identify observable indicators of confidence, implement a microscope-based intervention or interaction, analyze recurring patterns through transcripts, artifacts, and self-reports, and then interpret how those narrative features that were included in these classes influence the students' willingness to speak. Right. So my theoretical foundation had three main components. Uh, the first was socio-constructivism, which helped me understand learning as a social interaction between a students and teacher and themselves, and how to use scaffolding effectively, not just translating everything I say to Spanish. The second one was affective factors, which explain how anxiety and confidence can influence that oral participation and how they can be sometimes a block in that way. And finally, the game informed pedagogy or role play informed pedagogy or microscope based activities, which supported the use of role play and world building as a meaningful context so that they can actually use authentic language for explaining themselves. So you could be asking yourself why I chose microscope or what it is. But I selected microscope, which is a role-playing game, because it changes the logic of traditional speaking prompts or the traditional speaking exercises that are given in these classes. Because instead of isolated activities, students build over time a shared fictional history and through periods, events, and scenes. This gave them a narrative continuity between each of the sessions. There was also a fictional distance, so they could feel safer expressing their ideas. And there was shared authorship because that world was made by every one of them in each of the different groups. So they also held something about the history of that class. In other words, all of this helped to make the students feel both safer and have a clearer reason to actually speak. All right, so methodologically, this was proposed as a qualitative action research because the process included first diagnosing the problem, then planning the intervention, then acting through 6 sessions, the allotted time for these classes, and then reflecting and observing on those findings. However, that's not the end of the cycle because this qualitative action research can begin the cycle again. In my case, I could do the cycle again with different groups, not with the same group and start over again, but with each of those, I could try the same methodology, but with different context and ideas from the different students. Uh, for all of the data gathered, I collected evidence through the Microsoft Teams recordings and transcripts. Uh, I also had some observation guides before the classes. I filled out some field diaries and some teacher researcher journals. And finally, I had students self-reports in oral way. At the end of the last session, each of them expressed what they liked about the classes, how they felt safer, and explained how the classes helped them throughout their own process. The focus was not a statistical measure, but the interpretation of these classroom participations. Okay, so the intervention followed a 6 session world building journey. At first, the students created fictional societies, conflicts, and rules with a design palette where there were some restrictions and some things that were going to be inside their world. Then, in each of those classes, they reuse those worlds to discuss the different topics that were asked for me to give them in the course. So, for example, I had to give a class about fake news. So we returned to that class, but with the topic of the world that they created. So, how could fake news affect that world, or what would be a news reporter in that world? And we did the same thing with all of the topics for the course. So we worked with AI in education, with how the climate could affect our future. We talked about emotional first aid, and then we had the final session in which they had a mock trial, and they had to participate in that trial as characters from the worlds they created since the first class. Right, so now let's talk about some of the results, especially about the observable indicators that I chose for this research. So, first, we had some brief one word responses like yes, no, with no explanations. However, as time went on and I asked them to do so, they started to give more sustained responses and giving more expanded justifications about why they think what they say is true or what they say is correct. Then they had a heavy teacher dependence at the start, relying on scaffolding and translating some parts to Spanish, but they moved more towards peer interaction, so asking each of them. This was also because I used some activities in which they were in breakout rooms, so they weren't with me. So they had to interact between them to actually reach the answer or reach the conclusion that they wanted to reach. And finally, that hesitation and avoidance that was at the start, where I asked someone to participate and no one wanted to raise their hand, that also changed over time. Each time that the classes went on, I noticed more and more that when I asked something, there were more participants willing to raise their hand and answer back. And in the last session, the mock trial, we reached the highest student word share, which was at 37.4%, which means that in that last class, they talked way more than me in all of the other classes. In all of the other classes, the mic was way more focused on me. But in those classes, they had more time to participate. Right. So I think that my main conclusion will be meaningful contexts create confident voices. And why is that? Because this doesn't mean that confidence will appear automatically or that every student is going to be your uh, best participator. No. Uh, Confidence is built and emerges through a structure, support, and actual meaningful scaffolding. Fictional continuity can help transform those isolated speaking tasks that are way over there into a connected and purpose communication exercise. And with this, I thank you very much for having taken the time to watch me.